Joining me from the Citizens Association is also Tom DiChiara, our Vice President, Steve Welker, our Secretary. Therese Keating had, unfortunately, a prior engagement that she couldn't get out of, but she is our illustrious treasurer and wishes she could be here. And joining me also are our two facilitators and panelists, experts in the field for today, are Elizabeth Allen and Christina Gray Akpa. I'll talk more about their very impressive accomplishments in just a moment, but I just wanted to give a quick background on what we're doing today, some ground rules, and then we'll have Elizabeth and Christina dive right into the subject matter. So, as some quick background, this was in kind of the next step. We had a meeting that the Town Council and the Citizens Association co-hosted on the 15th, June 15th, I believe it was a couple Mondays ago, to talk about really how can we as a town, as a Garrett Park community, show advocacy and solidarity with the Black Lives Matters movement and racial equity and justice matters in general. And one of the resounding themes from that discussion was education. Education is so key. Making sure that we understand, and education is just kind of an ongoing process. It's not just one, but is an important step where we are now to make sure that we are moving in the direction that's really going to be truly beneficial for Black Lives Matters movement and racial equity in general. So this is one exciting milestone in that pursuit of education and continuing to better ourselves as individuals and as a community. In general, I also want to thank everyone who's been just so supportive. They've reached out specifically to the Citizens Association, been really supportive and encouraging of the past webinar, and then this one in particular, this workshop. Particularly, I want to thank Amelia Fogarty and Allison Pierce, who were really helpful and supportive in helping this get on the ground as well. So, with that, I'll go quickly over some just logistical ground rules to help make this remote experience as beneficial as possible. These are ones that if you've participated in our past webinars or the WebExes, they're very similar. So one, please remember to connect to only one audio input. So it's either your phone or your computer. That'll really help with just endless echoing loops, which is always terrible for the person. Stay muted. So Tom, again, is our mute unmute Jedi master. He will keep you muted, so don't worry about unmuting yourself. But if for any reason you do see yourself unmuted, just maybe shoot Tom a quick note so he can make sure to keep you muted. Right now, I think we're okay with bandwidth. If we start to sputter and it's difficult to kind of engage in this forum, then we might need to all turn off our webcams except for Elizabeth and Christina. But I think we're okay right now. So fingers crossed that stays the same. We're recording this. So Tommy, just a quick confirmation. Can you please make sure that we're recording this WebEx?
Yep. Yeah, we've been recording for a while.
Perfect.
Good.
Thank you. You're wonderful.
You bet.
And then for the second column here, questions and answers. During the presentation, there will be two very brief question and answer periods. So for those specifically, please, this is really important. The one way to provide your question or comment is to please direct chat Steve Welker. And so to remind people how to do that, at the bottom of your screen, you have kind of a toolbar. One of them is a little chat bubble. And so if you click on that chat bubble, you can, your chat box should pop up. You can find Steve Welker in the participant list and you direct chat him your question. And then Steve will make sure that it gets to our panelists. So, that'll really help if, Steve will be in charge of all that. So Christina and Elizabeth can fully engage and not get distracted by chat bubbles. So please make sure that you're sending those to Steve. During the presentation, those will be pretty short to kind of allow time for the remainder of the presentation. But we will have a couple, 5 minutes for each of those. There will be a longer sort of live chat, live question and answer session at the end of the presentation. And so with that, there are more options to provide your question or comment. One is, again, that same WebEx chat function sending to Steve Welker. Or the other is the hand raising function. So we used that at the last meeting. We tested that out, and that worked pretty well. But again, to remind everybody how to do that, in that toolbar at the bottom, you'll see the participant list. It's indicated by a person, a shape of a person, and three dashed lines. If you click on that, your participant list should come up. Find your name. If you hover over your name, there's a little hand raising function. And if you click on that, Tommy will see that you want to say something and will unmute you at the appropriate time. So again, don't worry about that right now. You can kind of make sure you look at your participant list and see how that works, but we'll remind you when we get to that session at the end of the presentation. And then you can also email Steve Welker, stevensdwelker@gmail.com. That's another way to get your question in during this time. Okay, and then, so those are the ground rules. If you have questions about that, obviously, direct chat me or Tommy or Steve at the beginning, and we'll make sure that everybody's kind of square with the ground rules. The next slide really quickly, Steve. So the one other quick thing, business piece of it is that we have Venmo now. So if you're a Garrett Park resident, please, this is a reminder, if you haven't paid your dues, please do so using Venmo. And then if you've paid your dues, or if you're not a Garrett Park resident, but you want to donate to the Citizens Association, that's obviously very much appreciated. It will help with things like this workshop that we're putting together today, and then hopefully workshops in the future. So we'll put this slide back up at another time, but it's really easy. If you have Venmo, just search Garrett Park Citizens Association and it should pop up. We're the only ones. So with that, I will, actually, let's see if I have any questions. I don't see any questions popping up on the ground rules. Feel free to, as I mentioned, chat me if you have a question. But with that, I'm going to turn it over. Well, let me introduce our speakers. I went through all of that and I didn't even introduce these very impressive ladies. So we've got Christina Gray Akpa, who is a Washington, D.C. area native with over 20 years of experience advancing equity through philanthropy, advocacy, education, arts, and grassroots action. We also have Elizabeth, who's also a DC native and a Garrett Park resident. We're so happy to have you, Elizabeth Allen, as one of our Garrett Park residents, and is an information specialist whose earlier career was spent as a librarian at news and organizations such as NPR and the National Press Club, among others. And she specializes in research and information literacy training. And collectively, they've both held numerous organizing and community building efforts and facilitated trainings and workshops on topics including anti-oppression, racial justice, health equity, arts activism, and youth development. So we're so grateful that you're both here, Christina and Elizabeth. And so thank you for being here. Christina, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Okay. Hopefully everyone is seeing the slides right now. So I guess Alicia or Elizabeth, if we're not seeing that, let me know. Thank you for that welcome, and thank you to the Citizens Association and for all of you for joining us today. This is such an important and urgent conversation to have right now, and I'm so pleased to be able to help facilitate today's workshop. This is really exciting, and so again, I thank you all for taking the time out of your evenings to be here. Thank you again to the Citizens Association for inviting us to lead this discussion and organizing today's event. Again, my name is Christina Gray Akpa. We have a lot we want to cover, so let me just kick things right off by sharing more about our goals for the workshop before I tell you a little bit more about who we are and what we hope to do tonight. So this is what we are hoping to accomplish in the next hour or so. We are going to be exploring some shared definitions and key concepts related to race and racism. We're going to set the context for what is happening currently with Black Lives Matter protests and other efforts to advance racial justice and equity. We're also going to be spending some time really highlighting the role that community members such as yourself can play as allies. And then lastly, we're going to spend some time sharing some strategies and recommendations for promoting anti-racism. Our hope is by the end of tonight's workshop, you can all walk away with some concrete and actionable ideas for how to talk about race meaningfully and become more engaged in efforts to advance racial justice and equity. So as Alicia shared, we know that a number of town members have been very vocal over the past several weeks. They've wanted to spur more action and have really been very eager to speak out. And again, the Citizens Association thought it would be really helpful to have this initial conversation that can hopefully inform any future action that the town takes or that individuals take, and make sure that folks are on the same page when it comes to shared language and strategies for doing this work. You know, so often these conversations just jump straight to what to do. What's the solution? But it really is equally important to think about how we frame and name and talk about these issues so we can devise solutions with greater clarity and impact. So here's our agenda for this evening. In just a moment, we're going to look more at that context. So what is this current moment we're in? How did we get here? Why now? We're also going to spend most of our time really looking at shared language, so pulling out some key terms and concepts, some that may be familiar to you, some that have kind of shifted in their definition, some that might be totally new to you. We'll also be spending time looking at how you can actually show up as an ally. What does it look like to do the work of anti-racism? And then we'll end on a few steps that people can take just to start right now where you are to really begin to make a difference. And as Alicia said, we'll have time at the end for a larger Q&A and discussion. There will be a couple smaller moments throughout the presentation where we'll pause for any immediate questions or thoughts or reflections. So that's what we're hoping to accomplish this evening. Before we move on, let me quickly share a little bit more about who we are and what we do and why this topic is so near and dear to us. As you heard Alicia share, Elizabeth and I work together in a consulting practice that supports individuals, communities, and organizations to build their capacity to support racial equity and social justice. We've both spent many years as organizers, activists, artists, trainers, and facilitators, educating and mobilizing people on issues of race and gender and power and privilege. So this work is deeply personal to us. We both bring our lived experience to this work. For me, not only my background working in the social sector, in philanthropy, in health, and in schools and other settings, but also as an African-American woman who was born in DC, who grew up in Prince George's County, and is now living here raising a Black son. So this is really deeply important, deeply personal work to us. And there are a few things that we like folks to know about how we approach these issues and the lens that we are bringing to this work. So here's the section where we tell you our caveats, our disclaimers, and fine print. So first of all, hopefully what you're seeing right now on your screen is a picture of Septima Clark. So that is the namesake for our consulting practice, the Septima Project. She was an early civil rights leader. She's actually widely known as the mother of the movement. She was responsible for educating many future civil rights leaders from Ella Baker to Martin Luther King Jr. She taught him. Her message really was to use education to advance social change, particularly grassroots community-led education. And that's what we hope to really bring to this work. And following in Septima's footsteps, we fundamentally believe that education is a path to liberation. You'll hear us say that over and over again. We really think that it is so fundamental to being able to do this work. It's important, it's essential. And that said, we don't have all the answers. None of us do. In fact, we will hopefully leave you with a few more questions and answers by the end of this evening. That's how we've known we've done a pretty decent job. We also believe in meeting people where they are. We recognize that we're all at different stages of the process of learning about race and unlearning racism and just understanding our role within these systems. We all have different entry points and our own lived experiences and perspectives that we're bringing. So we really do want to meet people where they are. Along the same lines, we know this work is a process. So we want to honor that process. We want to trust the process. We know that confronting and grappling with race and racism, it's not easy. It's not a linear process. It's complicated. It's painful. It's messy, but it's necessary. And with that in mind, we encourage everyone today to bring a sense of openness, curiosity, and intention to the conversation. And finally, before we dive in, here's what we call our spoiler alert. So cover your eyes, put us on mute if you don't want to know how this story ends. We like to get this out of the way first thing. So if you're ready, here's our spoiler. None of us will solve racism. Not single-handedly, not overnight, possibly not even in our own lifetimes. It doesn't mean we don't keep at it or we stop trying to get to that mountaintop that MLK described. We think, though, it's more effective to set some attainable goals. You can't solve racism, but here's what you can learn how to do. You can learn how to be anti-racist. You can learn how to talk openly and skillfully about race. And it is a skill. It is a practice. Just like we go to the gym, well, hopefully we haven't been going to the gym for the past couple months, but we go to the gym to strengthen muscles that we haven't necessarily used. Hopefully you all can begin to strengthen those muscles for talking about race. And lastly, you can learn how to be an ally. And that's what we hope we're able to help teach folks to do today. So let's jump right into setting the context. I think we can all agree that right now we are in the midst of an unprecedented moment of reckoning that most of us have not seen before when it comes to race and racism. And I think a lot of people are asking, how did we get here? Why does this feel so different? What happened? I think it's difficult to point to a single moment or incident that has galvanized people, but certainly we can't talk about what's happening without discussing the deaths of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, and George Floyd in Minnesota. Their deaths were powerful catalysts in sparking just the groundswell of anger and outrage and sadness and fear that we see playing out right now in uprisings and protests that continue to erupt across the country. And of course, it's worth noting the fact that their deaths come as the country has been plunged into months of a pandemic. So people have already been feeling isolated, overwhelmed, uncertain, distrustful of the government, disturbed by the fact that Black people and other people of color have been hit the hardest by COVID. We are really witnessing a powder keg moment. So people have been ready to explode. They are ready to explode. I also think it's important, though, to recognize that while Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery's deaths are shocking and have been so catalytic, they don't exist in isolation. Over the last several years, we know there have been several highly publicized violent deaths of unarmed Black people at the hands of the police or white vigilantes. Young boys like Tamir Rice in Cleveland, a 12-year-old, Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, Oscar Grant in the Bay, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, very young children like Ayanna Stanley Jones in Detroit, Eric Garner in New York, lesser known cases like Jessica Hernandez, a 17-year-old Latinx teenager from Denver, Colorado, shot by the police there. And I want to make sure that I lift up stories like Jessica's, because while we certainly will be centering, and I think a lot of this moment right now with protests is centering anti-Blackness, we want to lift up the fact that these issues are cutting across all communities of color. Black and brown people are being targeted disproportionately. In fact, Native Americans are disproportionately killed by the police more than any other race. So I really do want to take a moment to lift up the fact that communities of color are being affected by structural racism and police violence in very, very impactful ways. And of course, we know that there are also lesser known cases that have not garnered as much attention among Black women like Sandra Bland and Rekia Boyd. And I do want to pause also because, this is really just showing such a tiny fraction of the number of even just very publicized cases of people who have died at the hands of the police or vigilantes. And I want to make sure too, as we're having this conversation, and something that has definitely been happening over the last couple of weeks, is we don't necessarily want to parade these folks in their names and their pictures as a way to put Black pain and trauma on display. Because it's actually incredibly traumatic to be able to continue to see these images. But I do want to make sure we are taking a moment to honor their lives and their legacies and know again that there is a pattern here, and we're going to talk more about that pattern and what it means and how it connects to systemic racism. What we're seeing now in many respects is in fact the cumulative effects of years of people feeling hopeless, disempowered, and enraged as a result of police brutality and structural racism. And also, we can draw a direct line from what happened in the civil rights movement to right now. This is a quote from James Baldwin from 1986. So that summer, there were, many people might know and remember, that there were lots of high profile uprisings in many Black communities across the country in places like Watts, right here in DC, Detroit, Wilmington, Delaware. And I think this quote is so powerful because it's a reminder of how far we have not come. And while I think we haven't come as far as we'd like to believe, this moment really has shown us that while it's connected to the past, there's some very unique dynamics at play right now. People are making very different demands than before. They're taking new stances. They're also talking about these issues differently. And that's what we really want to spend some time focusing on right now. Because I think for us to understand what to do next, or where we can go from here, we have to figure out some shared language first and understand how the conversation about race and racism has shifted. Before we do that, I do want to pause and see if we have any initial questions. This is our first sort of break for a Q&A. So if anyone might have a question or comment or thought, reflection they'd like to share, I'll just pause. And Elizabeth, if something has come in, we can take a moment for maybe one or two questions.
I have not received anything. Tom, has anything come through? Oh, Stephen, I'm sorry. No, nothing. So we have no questions yet. So that's good. More time for content.
Well, again, please be thinking about your questions and comments and send them to Steve along the way. And then again, we'll have a couple other times for you to share any thoughts, reflections, or questions. But now we want to look at some shared language and how our understanding of race and racism has evolved in recent years. So what is different now when we talk about race? And let me start by just acknowledging that talking about race is hard. It's complex, it's daunting. The language can feel really tricky to grasp or to keep up with, but it's not that people are incapable of talking about it. Most of us have just never been taught the vocabulary for discussing race. And I think right now is actually a very opportune moment because we have so many more tools than ever to discuss and just articulate race and racism. There's just so much more specificity, I think, and just overall depth to understanding and describing race. You'll see on the right side some words that you might be familiar with. You know, I think these words, a lot of them are still very useful. That is often sort of how the conversation about race began and ended up until very recently. But I don't think those terms really capture the full story when it comes to race and racism. So let's look at some key terms that are more precise and expansive. And we can't begin to explore the language of race without actually just first looking at what race means. So what is race? It doesn't exist. It's a social construct. Most of us were taught in school or learned early on that the people of Earth could be categorized and separated into a few different races, mostly on what people looked like or where they're from, maybe what language they spoke. But we know now that race, as we thought about it, it just doesn't exist. Science has shown us there's no genetic or biological basis. In fact, studies have shown there's more diversity within people of the same race and ethnicity as there is between people of different races and ethnicities. It's a fuzzy concept. Race is inconsistent. It is a moving target. It's also a pretty recent idea. There is a long and fascinating and troubling history of how race was invented, especially here in the US. For folks who want to do a real deep dive, I encourage you to look up some of Neil Painter's work that really looks at the history of how white people were invented in the US. You'll see here in this photo, for example, two children, both enslaved in Louisiana. They are both considered Black. If you'll notice, the one girl is significantly lighter than the boy, but because of the way Blackness and race was defined at that time, especially through the one drop rule, she's considered Black. They are both enslaved. We know that race has meant different things at different points in history. There are also different definitions of race from around the world. There are places in Latin America that I could go to and probably have 5 different ways that people describe my race, simply based on my skin color, my hair texture, and my features. We also know in different places around the world, there are just other ways to even talk about racial groups. For instance, in South Africa, where there's a legally recognized race of colored people that is completely different from our system of codifying racial groups here in the US. I think it's also important to remember that even white people weren't always white. There are times in our history in the US when Italians and Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans and Irish, they were not considered white. They became white. They earned the privileges of whiteness over time, which is why one of the things that I think is really helpful to think about is the fact that race may not be real, but the consequences are. And so let's look at what some of those consequences are. This definition of racism, it may be different from what many of us are taught. In fact, if you still look in most dictionaries, you will find something to the effect of racism is when one group of people think they're superior to the other group. But we really just want to make sure that we are calling attention to the fact that the way racism is talked about now, it's not about individual hateful acts or ignorance or thinking that one group is just better than the other, or the prototype of either Archie Bunker or now extremists with tiki torches in Charlottesville. When we're talking about race and the way people are talking about racism now, it involves power, systems, and it is something deeply embedded within society, not just within individuals. One of the ways that I found really helpful to think about this comes out of the work that the Kellogg Foundation has led with their National Racial Healing Initiative. They talk about the hierarchy of human value. So we know that there are people of certain races who've been assigned a different level of value than other people. And we have built an entire system based on that hierarchy that has endured and adapted and only gotten stronger over time. And that system of racism is perpetrated in a few forms. You know, again, I want to call out the fact that interpersonal racism is not the beginning and ending of racism, but it is important to note. In fact, oftentimes that gets expressed through microaggressions, and Elizabeth will talk more about that shortly. But I do also want to call attention to institutional and structural level racism. And when we talk about institutional racism, we mean racism that is entrenched within systems. So for instance, the education system or the criminal justice system, which we see writ large right now happening with current protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. And we'll talk more about structural racism in a second, but I also just want to make sure we look at the fact that often racial prejudice, bias, discrimination, and stereotypes have been used synonymously with racism. But when we're talking about racism, we're really talking again about systems of power. So those are symptoms of racism, but not racism itself. Which brings us to structural racism. It's complex, it's dynamic, it's again a system that is deeply entrenched throughout every level of society. It's not something that many of us actively choose to perpetuate. Most of us are not the ones writing or voting on the bills that might perpetuate structural racism, but we're all conditioned to participate in it unconsciously. Structural racism is the air we breathe. And I want to share just a few examples of how that can play out systematically. So we know that there's a long history of structural racism in housing in this country. Through racial covenant deeds, through redlining. This is an example in a map of DC. So an old map that actually grades sections of the city and surrounding suburbs using race as a criterion for actually identifying more desirable areas and less desirable areas. And we know that that has happened historically where Black communities were pushed out of or pushed into areas that became less desirable, while white people had the ability to move into other neighborhoods and also the ability then to generate the intergenerational wealth that comes from home ownership and housing. We see it in health. I spent a large part of my career trying to raise the visibility about health inequities and health disparities. One disparity that has actually become a more pressing issue that's gotten more attention are the disparities that exist among African American women and babies when it comes to infant maternal mortality. Even Serena Williams had her own personal experience with that disparity. But we know that even accounting for socioeconomic status, even among college-educated, middle-class Black women, we have poor health outcomes when it comes to maternal and child health. And studies have shown that the root of that is the impact of racism across the life course. So that creates a pathway for these poor health outcomes and these higher rates of maternal and infant mortality among African American women and babies. We see structural racism in our school system, especially through the school to prison pipeline. We know that Black students are suspended or expelled 3 times more frequently than white students. Folks may have seen the recent data to come out of Montgomery County Public Schools early this week. I encourage people to check out the article about it in Bethesda Magazine. But the data show that Black children only make up 1/5 of MCPS enrollment, but half of all arrests. So what do we do about this? What's the solution? This is where racial equity comes in. I like this definition because it essentially says racial equity is when we have achieved a level where race does not protect your life. It occurs when everyone has what they need to thrive, no matter what their race. I think another feature of equity that's important to point out is that it also means we acknowledge and account for past and current inequities, and the people most impacted are involved in the decision-making process for changing those systems. I want to say a quick word about equity before I pass things to Elizabeth, because I think in general, that's a word that we all hear a lot more. And I think that it's sometimes hard for folks to really be able to think about equity versus equality. I like this graphic because it really does illustrate how equality is when we treat everyone exactly the same. Equity is when we treat everyone fairly. So instead of getting the same thing, no matter what, people get what they need. And I really like to think too that equity is not only about an outcome, it is a value, it is a process. People may have seen this example too, this graphic that shows again the difference between equality and equity. I love this amended version that shows what liberation could possibly look like when there's no wall at all dividing people. But I think that another word that is useful in this conversation that people will often use interchangeably with racial equity, but again, I do want to lift up racial justice. Because I think there is a subtle yet distinct difference that's important to point out. Justice really highlights the fact that we need a proactive, deliberate process of reinforcing laws and systems and supports to achieve that vision of racial equity. And that is fundamentally what people are fighting for in the streets right now, racial equity and racial justice. But now I'm going to pause and pass things off to Elizabeth to share how we get to that vision of racial equity and justice.
Thanks, Christina. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Elizabeth. I am your neighbor. Some of you may not have seen me much because I'm allergic to the sun, but I have lived here for over 10 years. You just don't see me outside very much, but I'm here working away. And yes, we are both very committed to making sure people have a shared language to talk about this and normalize discussions about race. So on to my terms. Here you will see the American philosopher and activist Angela Davis. In a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. So then, next slide, Christina. Sorry, we are not in the same place, so this won't be like super pro style TED talk. I might have to ask her to advance the slide. Thank you. So anti-racism The definition is the work of actively opposing racism by advocating for changes in political, economic, and social life. So, as Christina has spent a lot of time discussing, racism is structural and systemic. And so, right now, I want to talk about what that means for white people. White people grow up steeped in these systems, and yet we rarely talk about race in terms of what whiteness actually means or how it shapes us. One barrier to overcoming these societal injustices is the widely held belief that racism is a conscious bias that's held by bad people. Bad people are racists. So racism may go against our own beliefs. We may never feel negatively towards Black people. We may never make a racist joke or laugh at a racist joke or make a slur, but that's so we see ourselves as good, and therefore we aren't racist. But this creates a false binary that racism is something you are either a racist or you are not. You are good or you are bad, and that sort of obscures the idea that this is a larger system. These racism does occur, as Christina said, on with these individual hateful acts, but that can keep us from focusing on defining racism as an overarching system. So when we think about it that way, we don't engage in the analysis that's necessary to challenge these problems. So this good-bad dichotomy is sort of the fundamental misunderstanding that that drives a lot of confusion and even defensiveness around issues of race when white people have to examine it. When we reach a crisis point, as with George Floyd and sadly, many people before him, oftentimes that makes white people realize they have to do more. They have to examine these issues more deeply. And that's a journey. As Christina said, it's a journey. People have different entry points. And missteps are inevitable because white people, as I said, are not brought up talking about race. As a white person, you are neutral. The world is sort of centered around you. So race doesn't come up in your everyday thinking. So we aren't really experts at race. We may mess up by mistake. We may be unintentionally insensitive, accidentally offensive. We could even be harmful. For instance, we might say at the very beginning of this, well, all lives do matter, or I don't see race. Everybody's the same. That's not really where it's at right now. And you might get some pushback on that. And you might think, oh no, oh my gosh, does that make me a racist? I'm a bad person. No. There's, and at that point, sometimes that's when people begin to act defensively and maybe zone out. Their identity is so caught up in being a good person, a non-racist. When that's challenged, it can be very, very difficult to deal with. So if you pivot from thinking about this as whether or not you don't say I'm not a racist. You think of it as I am committed to anti-racism, and I am committed to disrupting racism where I see it. It's a journey and not a label. So what does that mean? What does it mean to commit to being an anti-racist? How do you do that? Well, one way is you commit to questioning and confronting and interrupting racist behavior that you see. Someone says something racist in front of you, you say that's not okay. I mean, for instance, we've seen that come up on the listserv where there was an incident at the farmer's market. And unfortunately, it seems as though no one said anything. The anti-racist action to do there is to disrupt that and to say, no, that's not okay. It also requires you to have the shared vocabulary and the shared understanding of how structures work. So you can be observant and on the lookout for for racism when you see it. What does it look like at your work? What does it look like at your child's school? Are there Are there people of color in positions of power, managers, teachers, etc.? What are the police stats in your community? You have to be an observer and an active participant. Being non-racist is not a passive action. So you have to listen to the voices of the communities that are affected by these issues. And if you get pushback on anything you might say, you have to not take it personally. You have to not get defensive. The instinct to get defensive or to take things personally, that's on the next slide, white fragility, which is a term that you may have been hearing a lot about lately. There's a best-selling book called White Fragility. A lot of the kids are reading it these days. But what does it mean? It's a term that was coined by an educator named Robin DiAngelo, and it's a very popular book. And she says she uses the term fragility to capture the fact that it takes very little to upset white people when it comes to discussions of race. Their comfort is disturbed. They're forced to face issues that they don't usually have to. So for many white people, the idea that being white carries any meaning at all can be sort of a mind-blowing moment. How could anyone ascribe anything to me just based on the color of my skin? They're used to being seen as individuals. We are used to being seen as individuals, the way society works out. So generalizing about white people can elicit an emotional reaction. The fragility she's talking about, and she calls it weaponized defensiveness. So weaponized tears, weaponized hurt feelings, and so in her framework, that is effectively, she calls that bullying. And she also, this is particularly relevant to a town like ours, Garrett Park, that has a long tradition of very active political engagement. The white progressive can be the biggest offender here sometimes, because their identity is so wrapped up in being not racist and being good that you can live in horror of being accused of being a racist. So often if you feel that happens, the reaction is an emotional one. Now, oftentimes when there's an emotional reaction, it leads to the people of color who need to discuss these issues just avoiding it, because it is emotionally taxing and it is extra work. And let me give you a real life example of this that you all may have seen play out. During the Michael Cohen hearings, you may recall that he stated that the president, he believed, was a racist. So Representative Mark Meadows brought a HUD employee, an African-American woman, Lynn Patton, up and said she wouldn't work for a racist. Now, another representative, a woman of color, Rashida Tlaib, took exception to that and said that was insensitive. And the fact that someone would use a Black woman as a prop in the House of Representatives is racist. So Mark Meadows didn't take that very well. I don't know if you all remember how this played out, but he became very upset and very angry and demanded an apology and appealed to his friend Elijah Cummings, saying, "You're my friend. You know I'm not a racist." It ended up with Rashida Tlaib having to apologize. So she had to apologize for making what is probably a very salient point. And everyone had to soothe Mark Meadows' feelings. That's a pretty high profile case of white fragility. And then from there, I'll go on to microaggressions. So because oftentimes engaging in conversations about race don't end well for the people bringing them up. They may end up in tears. They may end up in you having to apologize to Mark Meadows for something that was ostensibly uncool to do. Many people avoid these discussions with white people. And because of that dynamic, many white people are unaware of a phenomenon that Christina mentioned earlier called microaggressions. So probably many of you have heard this term, and that's kind of our goal, terms you may have heard but are wondering what exactly that is. A microaggression, it's not exactly new. It was first coined in the 70s by Chester Pierce. He was an African-American professor, an ed professor at Harvard. And he used it to describe slights and demeaning comments that that specifically at that point Black people had to endure every day when dealing with those who had implicit bias and racism. But it's come back. I mean, it's being used, it's being referenced a lot more now. And there's another professor at Columbia, professor of counseling, Dr. Daryl Wing Sue, and he wrote a book called Microaggressions. So he defines them as the brief and commonplace daily, verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. Whew, that's a mouthful. But basically, it's saying that you got to put up with a lot of crap every day based on not being white or not being part of the dominant group. So an example that he uses, so he was born, I believe in New Jersey, but oftentimes he's told he speaks very good English. Well, yeah, he does. He's American, but and so that may seem from the speaker well-intentioned. It may seem a compliment, but it's actually the opposite, because what it does is it implies the message that you are not a true American. You are not at the high end of that hierarchy of value that Christina talked about, and you won't be. It serves to reinforce the hierarchies and power structures. And people of color, Black people, they are subjected to those many, many times a day, often. And the intent maybe isn't bad, but over time, it can have really deleterious effects on your confidence, on your mental health, on your feelings of belonging, or how much you can achieve or your success. I mean, there are plenty of other examples, and I encourage you, a quick Googling of microaggressions will give you a lot of fodder. But people who are followed in stores all the time for being Black, and then told, well, I didn't see that didn't happen, or saying, about these events that are going on right now, saying that's not the America I know. Well, it is the America a lot of people know, and when you convey that, you are sort of invalidating their experiences as real Americans and people with real value. So they're basically constant reminders that you fall outside the norm. And they can really another aspect to it is you can be labeled as too sensitive for getting upset about minor things, but they're not minor, and they build up and they do real damage, and they are largely invisible to white people. And the reason that they are invisible to us is white privilege, is our white privilege. So that's next. White privilege is an advantage, good, or resource that people with ascribed white racial identities receive and or have greater access to compared to non-white people. This is one of those phrases that can really stir up that fragility. There can be a knee-jerk reaction like, well, what privilege? I didn't have it easy. I don't have any privileges more than anyone else. That's really not what it means. It means that it doesn't mean your life was easy or you didn't have hardship. It means the color of your skin will not be one of your hardships. It will not negatively impact you. So this term really first came to widespread attention from a feminist scholar at Wellesley named Peggy McIntosh, and she wrote a very famous essay about it called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And it's set out to define what it is. And she said, white privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks. Meaning you just have a lot of special access from the very beginning based on the color of your skin. So the way she was prompted to write this essay was she asked herself every day, what do I benefit from on a daily basis that I didn't earn? And meaning, everyone works hard, but you might get further along if you don't have to deal with some of the microaggressions and systemic racism and the school to prison pipeline. Those are all generally don't affect us as much. And it's not something that you can't remove this knapsack. You can't take it off. You will have it until the day you die or until systemic racism is ended. So you don't choose to be part of this system, but you are. And you can't say I'm not going to be privileged anymore. And there are tons. Peggy McIntosh's initial essay had something like 50 examples of white privilege. It's been updated. The definitions have been expanded since then, and the idea has been expanded since then. But some examples are that, I can, if I want to move, I can be pretty sure that I can buy a house somewhere I can afford and that I want to live in. And once I get there, I can be sure my neighbors will be neutral or pleasant to me. On a smaller scale, privilege is that white people are more likely to control conversations. They are more likely to have their ideas and contributions taken seriously. And they can generally assume when they go out in public, they won't be challenged and asked to explain by white people or people in authority what they are doing. And that's a really big one in terms of what's going on right now. And why a lot of people of color can't reasonably expect that they will walk away alive from any interaction with law enforcement. And that is a big part of white privilege. So that leads us to white supremacy. And all of these realities, white privilege, and the structural benefits, they point to the fact that we live in a white supremacist state. And so what does that mean? It doesn't just mean the KKK. White supremacy is the systemic provision of political, social, economic, and psychological benefits and advantages to white people. White supremacy describes the society we live in, a society that values white people and all the norms associated with them and with whiteness as the ideal. It's the supposed superiority and centrality of white people and whiteness. It's the positioning of whiteness as the standard and anything non-white as deviation from the norm. And that system rests on the historical and current accumulations of these structural powers privileges, and it elevates white people as a group. So this is a simpler way of saying all this, is that every facet of our society teaches us that white lives matter. So that's why it is important to affirm Black Lives Matter. These are the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. They created this movement, Black-centered movement called Black Lives Matter in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the murder of Trayvon Martin. So, this isn't brand new. It's been around a minute. And according to the founders, it's a call for action, a tool to reimagine a world where Black people are free to exist, free to live, and a tool for our allies to show up differently for us. It's a human rights movement. So that's why you're hearing a lot about it now. It was in 2014 when Mike Brown was murdered in Ferguson. A lot of their organization coalesced around that. And as a result of their work on the ground there, many chapters, it's a chapter-based organization, member-led, and many chapters were begun after Ferguson. And now it's the Black Lives Matter global network. And its organizers have ousted anti-Black politicians, passed critical legislation, and have helped redefine this narrative and the way we talk about systemic racism. So, Black Lives Matter, of course, doesn't mean only Black Lives Matter. um, it's the acknowledgement of the fact that Black lives are undervalued in the society, as witnessed by the fact that the brutalization and extrajudicial murder of Black people continues at an unrelenting pace. This sign is perfect. We said Black Lives Matter, never said only Black Lives Matter. We know that all lives matter. We need your help with Black lives because Black lives are in danger. And that's, the bottom line. And this, if you're being, I think this sums it up nicely. I think all lives matter. We should care exactly equally at all times about everything. And then you see two houses on fire. So which fire do you put out? The system of brutalization and murder of Black people is a house on fire. And when you say all lives matter, you are erasing the concerns of the people whose houses are on fire. So it's, of course, that is an entry point into the journey because no one is denying all lives matter. But if you're tempted to say it, think about this. Do you want to be the person who's hosing down the perfectly fine house, or do you want to be putting the fire out? So that is our shared vocabulary lesson. And now another time we will take some questions if there are any.
And again, people will have a chance later to ask any questions or share any comments or thoughts or reflections that might be coming up. We do want to make sure that we leave you all plenty of time if things do surface, but otherwise, we still would love to share a few thoughts about what it looks like to do the work of anti-racism.
I'm so sorry, Christina. Can I just remind people of how to maybe provide the questions, if that's okay? Sorry, just 2 seconds. So as a reminder, to share a question right now during the presentation, later on we'll have a little more flexibility, but during this presentation time, if you go to the participant list, again, it's at the bottom of your screen, and it's signified. You can open up the participant list by the symbol that looks like a person. It's a little person insignia with the 3 dashed lines. It should open up a participant panel for you. Just go to your name, and if you click on the hand raised function, that'll show Tom that you want to make a comment or question. The other one that is better for during the presentation time, if you go to Stephen Welker, he's also in the participant panel. You can click on the little chat bubble beside his name, or you can go to the chat function in the participant or in the toolbar at the bottom. Click on Stephen Welker's name and just type the question to him. And that will make sure that gets funneled to our panelists.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Christina.
So we're going to jump right back in now and start to look at what it means to do the work of anti-racism and begin to dismantle those structural systems of racism and white supremacy and white privilege. So Elizabeth, I will pass it back to you.
Okay, so an ally. What is an ally? This is my own spoiler alert. Could you go to the next slide? I, as a white person, would never call myself an ally because an ally is something that someone else recognizes you as. An ally is not a noun. It isn't an identity, a label, or something to claim. Being an ally is taking action, making a stand, doing something to make a difference by standing up against oppression and marginalization, You are an ally when someone recognizes you as an ally. I would refer to myself as working in solidarity with Black people and people of color to achieve racial justice. And that's a mouthful, I know, but that's part of the work. We can all say a few extra words. Being an ally is a lot like defending your PhD. Your work is going to be reviewed, and you're then, if deemed deemed acceptable and showing growth and actionable outcomes, you'll get the title. But it doesn't last in perpetuity. It can be taken away real fast. It's an ever evolving thing to do the work of an ally. If you want the chance to work towards being an ally, the main thing is, I think you need to let your ego needs to slip away. Ego is not involved in this work. You need to listen really to the affected communities more than you're talking. You need to understand that what you want and need and think are useful on your own journey of understanding race, but they mean really nothing to the greater cause. The only thing that matters is you're doing the work of dismantling the system. And that can be hard for white people to hear or to really enact because of white supremacy, because it teaches us the importance of our individuality and the inherent value of our opinions. So if you find yourself focusing on how the process is making you feel and your reaction to it, that's what's called centering yourself. And it's a sign that your motivation for this work, really, you need to review it. It's said that the struggle for racial justice is not a feel-good emotional journey for white people. Its sole goal is the liberation of Black people and people of color. And what often prevents well-meaning white people from achieving allyship is the inability to handle having intentions questioned, good intentions. If you find yourself wanting to take actions that receive pushback from the affected communities, people of color, then the best action you can take there in your attempt at solidarity is to stop and really listen and think about why it is that maybe you suspect you might know better than a person of color or a person with a differing view, and realize that it is an immense privilege to demand the benefit of doubt as to your intentions. Why do you expect that? Why do you assume that your good intent will trump any possible negative outcome? And so, for example, there was recently a protest at the Bethesda Library during the George Floyd protests, and many good intentioned people who really wanted to show up to support showed up, and there was at least a segment of the crowd there that renounced their white privilege. You can't do that. It doesn't work that way. That's not how any of this works. And while the intent of that may to be helpful and show support, it is actually harmful. It demonstrates that there's not a full grasp of how the system works, and that meaningful change is still kind of far off. It can be a little bit demoralizing. So it's also an example of performative allyship, which I know is a term that people have heard. And performative allyship, this isn't about you. So the slide sort of indicates that maybe sometimes people show up, take a selfie, feel good about themselves, have something to post on the gram. That's not really what the work should be about. Performative allyship is when an individual or individuals from a majority or privileged group profess their support and solidarity with a marginalized group in a way that isn't helpful. It draws attention away, and it may actively harm the group. So a way to wrap your head around this is there's been a ton of it lately, and the most obvious examples are from brands. You've seen a lot of performative allyship from brands, even if you didn't know to call it that. So for instance, the NFL commissioner issued a statement of condolence to the Floyd family and stated their ongoing commitment to ending systemic racism all well, Colin Kaepernick was still not part of the NFL. He was sort of ostracized for peacefully protesting these same issues. So why did they feel the need to support? It's a show, really. And additionally, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez just called out our Washington football team for posting in support, and said, "You really want to stand for racial justice? Change your name." So the actions that these brands and corporations are taking, it's truly all talk and no action. It's pandering and it's not helpful. It's done to make themselves look good, feel good about taking a stand. And so how does this apply? This applies even down to communities. There are a lot of communities just like ours that are grappling with things like, do we paint Black Lives Matters on our street? Does that really help? What is it really productive? So think of it this way: is a proposed action materially helping any person affected, or is it an attempt to signal that you care, and that you're good people? So just a quick example for our town. I've heard a lot of talk from people, and I've seen on the listserv the suggestion of a sign of some sort, saying that maybe this would be a discrimination-free zone. I get it. There's a tradition of signs here in Garrett Park. I grew up in Tacoma Park. We were very proud of our nuclear-free zone sign as well. So I understand the impetus for a sign. But if you really think about that, is it helpful? Following the criteria of performative allyship. Is it helpful? Probably not, because it's just not going to be true. There's no way that can be true, because just look at the incident at the farmers market, some of the language on the listserv, some of the discussions around possible school redistricting. We cannot make the claim in good faith that there is no discrimination. So then it's sort of becomes meaningless, and the definition of performative. The impact would likely be the opposite of the intent. The intent is good, but it doesn't materially help anyone. So that is an example of performative. So we want to think about things that are actually helpful and not just shows of support. And then I'll turn it over to Christina for how to do the work.
Thank you. And I just want to be mindful of time, because I know that we do want to leave a little bit to still have a Q&A. We just had so much to share. We wanted to make sure that we really were elevating some key points to help people really navigate the conversations that are happening right now. So I'm going to go through a list of what it can look like to do the work of an ally. And I'll absolutely echo Elizabeth. There are no easy steps. There's no simple toolkit that we can offer you to being an ally or doing the work of an ally, but we can offer some entry points, some places where you can start. And the first thing is that we can't overstate the importance of starting with self-reflection. Anti-racism is an inside job. It is critical to start this process with your own internal assessment, so you can interrogate your own views and beliefs and attitudes about race, unconscious or unconscious. And then as you've begun that reflection, ask yourself and challenge yourself to rethink the narrative about race that you have. What stories were you told about race, your race, other people's races? When did you become aware of race? If there's one thing I can offer from this hour-and-a-half workshop, if you're looking for a place to start, if you want to do something, it's ask yourself that question and really reflect on, when did you become aware of race? Because again, I think part of the systems that exist with structural racism and white privilege means that many people never have to ask themselves that. They don't have a single moment they can point to. But also ask yourself, how does race show up in your day-to-day life, at work, at school? How are some ways that perhaps racism is knowingly or unknowingly embedded into your life? And then as you've begun that process, that of inner work, there's a lot more to learn. So if we sound like a broken record, it's really because we want to make it clear how important it is to do the hard work of learning about race and anti-racism. So often people are ready to just jump to action. But again, if you skip these initial steps, you really can end up perpetuating the very same racial inequities that you seek to address. And you can cause active harm to Black people and people of color. So take the time to do your homework, read, watch, listen, learn, get educated. Right now, there are so many great reading lists that are being recommended, that are floating around. They are a great place to start. If you're someone who wants hard empirical data, you can take the implicit bias test from the Project Implicit website from Harvard. That's another good place to start. But also start with your own self-audit. So look at the media that you consume. Where do you get your information? Who do you get your information from? What voices are missing? How diverse are your relationships? We are not suggesting that you run out and find a Black person to befriend, but we do want to encourage you to think deeply about how many meaningful relationships you might have with a person of color where you have been to their homes, you know about their family, or is there someone that you have actually discussed race with? If no one comes to mind, it might be worth digging into that and reflecting some more. And next, we also can't overstate the importance of listening. Make sure you are listening to Black people and people of color, and listen with humility. If you are talking more than you're listening, there might be some of that performative allyship going on that Elizabeth described. And along the same lines, know that this will be uncomfortable. Again, we have to stress that. Embrace the process, though. You will say the wrong thing. You might stumble over your words. That's part of the process. When you feel these difficult and uncomfortable feelings, reflect on that. What is coming up for you? Is it an urge to do something? Is it the deep pain of acknowledging racism and perhaps what role you may have to be complicit in that system? Are you feeling confused that you don't know what to do or how to help? Are you feeling like you just don't know where to start? Begin to peel back those layers and remember that your discomfort is still a tiny fraction of what people of color experience every day. Can you bear some of that pain without centering your whiteness? What will you do with those feelings? And then lastly, when you started that process of learning about race and shifting your own narratives about race, that's when you're ready to speak up and take action. And action doesn't have to mean taking it to the streets or marching to the state capitol with policy demands. That's important work. Lots of people are doing it. But start with speaking up in your own corner of the world. That means talking about race with your children and families. Have you had a conversation about what's happening in around the country and around the world with the protests with your kids? Are you holding other white people accountable and not expecting people of color to do the labor of calling out racism or explaining race? That's really one of the most powerful roles you can play as an ally, educating other white people and making sure that you are spreading the gospel of racial equity and anti-racism. Right now, if you want to help Black people, the best thing you can do is help other white people. Because right now, the process that Black people are going through is one of healing. That's what we're focusing on. That's our work. We need white allies, or people who are doing the work of being a white ally, who can interrupt prejudice, who can call out the racist joke, who can call out the racist meme shared on Facebook, who can be the one to start the conversation about race instead of waiting for a person of color to do so. That's how we start showing up as allies committed to anti-racism. So if you're still asking yourself, what do I do next? I've done all those steps. I've been learning and doing lots of self-reflection. I'm ready for action. Before we wrap up and open the floor for any questions, we do have a few final recommendations for moving forward with strategies at the individual and collective level. So you might not be surprised, of course, that our first recommendation is to educate yourself some more, because you can never learn too much about race and racism. And if you're feeling like education feels too passive, it's not. Education is action. You can deepen your awareness by joining reading groups, starting an anti-racist study group or racial equity committee in your kid's school, in your community, at work. Go through advanced trainings like the Undoing Racism workshops from the People's Institute for Survival and beyond. Then, when you've learned more, pause. Reflect on what you've learned before you launch action. We'll say it again and again. The impulse to jump ahead to just doing something can be another way of unintentionally centering whiteness. So take your time. If you're ready for the next step, you can support existing organizations. The work to dismantle racism has been going on long before Amy Cooper's name ever entered the news cycle, before the latest round of protests. People of color have been leading and working in racial justice movements for decades, for centuries. And so the fact that some people are just now really acknowledging that is really, in many ways, part of structural racism. So it is essential that we honor and acknowledge the work of people of color who've been leading racial justice and racial equity organizing and advocacy and movement building efforts. Please don't reinvent the wheel. This is not the time to go out and start a 501c3. But you can connect with existing organizations. You can volunteer. You can share their work, amplify their voices. You can learn from what they've already done. And most importantly, you can donate. As someone who has spent many years in philanthropy trying to push funders to invest in racial equity, I can tell you firsthand there is still a tremendous need for resources to support this work. Money is action. That is a way to divest some of your privilege. Funding decisions are policy decisions. Financially supporting the people doing this work on the front lines is key. This is just a start, but if you begin with these strategies, you really can begin to affect change. And I'll pass things off to Elizabeth one more time to share some strategies for the town specifically to think about as people move forward with addressing anti-racism.
So I'm going to make this real quick. It's something we can revisit as a town, but everything that Christina just said, absolutely, those are the most important next steps. But what does that mean for our community? According to the 2018 American Community Survey, Garrett Park is almost 94% white. Why? First of all, we should think about that number. Why is that? Are we a safe, welcoming space? I mean, there are lots of other reasons that it is for those numbers. That can be a whole reading group on its own. But with that number, we should explore how those racial inequities may be embedded within our own town policies. If we're going to do a personal audit, let's take a look at our town policies, our practices. It's very likely they reflect our racial demographic. What can be changed? What can be updated? There are also, more immediately, who are our vendors? Are there opportunities for us to hire Black or minority-owned businesses? Where can we do actual materially productive work right now? That requires an audit of what our current situation is. There are steps I know that people in town have already started to talk about: reading groups, historical presentations. Again, education is action. You need to remember that it's not the end game, but it's a further step to explore where to place our time and resources. And then this is a much bigger topic, but it fits in with what kicked this all off. Which was a nationwide protest sparked by police brutality. How does our town interact with law enforcement? The murder of George Floyd has led for calls to reform and defunding and even abolishing police departments. We need to have a serious look at our relationship to the police. Just in the last few years, there have been calls on the listserv for more policing. That combined with calls that I've seen to call in anything that looks out of place. What does that mean? Well, that's white supremacy in action. How do we disrupt that as a town? Additionally, we need to really get down on a local level. There's going to be a Montgomery County bill on use of force and policing that's up next week. And we need to be aware of these things and how they will impact our community. In fact, Montgomery County just passed a resolution last month declaring racism a public health crisis. The stats there are pretty intense about the lived experience of white residents of Montgomery County versus Black residents, with higher rates of unemployment and poverty, lower rates of home ownership, college attainment, income, and twice as likely to be arrested Black residents as white residents. These are all issues that people have been organizing around in our own backyard. And how can we support them? again, what can we leverage as a town? Our resources are, we are a wealthy town. The best thing we can do is donate, fundraise, and figure out how to come together to use those resources most effectively. And again, how do we make our neighbors who aren't white feel safe to discuss these microaggressions and worse that they've experienced? There have been allusions to incidents on the listserv. There's been chatter, and that's unacceptable. So a one-time workshop probably isn't enough. We have to work to overcome this as ongoing work. That's what being an ally is. And so what is that going to look like? That's something the town needs to really figure out going forward. And with that, I think we can open up to questions. Oh, sorry, resources.
Well, before we begin our Q&A, thank you. We wanted to just share a very short list of some go-to resources that can help in your own journey to learn more about race and anti-racism and showing up as an ally. We know there are a ton of resources out there. This is just a small sampling. We're happy to follow up with more if people are interested, or any of the titles of books or other sites that we mentioned throughout our presentation. Thank you all really again for just opening this space for us to share. We know we had a lot to share with you tonight, but we do want to take a moment in our final 10 minutes to open the floor to you for any questions, reflections, or thoughts you'd like to share. Remember to ask a question. For this portion, you can actually raise your hand and we'll actually be able to unmute you. Tom will be able to unmute anyone who wants to just ask a question directly. So we'll spend a few minutes. If folks do just have questions they want to, or comments or reflections that they want to share right now.
If I could just really quickly interject, we missed a question somehow that came through earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and read it for us. So this question was about proactive versus reactive allyship. The person writes, I don't feel like I have a right to be proactive in day-to-day, meaning it will be seen as being performative, versus obviously speaking up whenever you hear or are in a situation where you have the opportunity to step up. Where is the balance?
I'm happy to start, Elizabeth, if you want to jump in. I think that's actually a really great question that I imagine a lot of people have on their minds right now. I think, and this is something that even in preparation for this, Elizabeth and I spent a lot of time talking about it, because I think right now, of course, there is this real impetus to show up as an ally. And people are aware of the dynamics of, if I'm doing something, is this performative? Is this materially productive? I think we've all seen lots of examples that have been floating around on our social media feeds and in the news. I would say again, I think right now does demand extra proactiveness than perhaps in the past, because of the urgency of this current moment. But again, I think that people can be proactive starting where you are in your corner of the world again. I think being proactive as an ally, it could mean starting that conversation at your dinner table with your children to really ask, what do you know about race? Do you see color? What do you think it means to be anti-racist? Do you know what's happening right now? Let's talk about what's happening with these protests. I think there are ways to be proactive without it being necessarily performative. And I think that there is a balance there. And again, I think that is part of the journey and the process, just navigating that. It is very much a delicate line and a dance that folks do. And I think that it is important, though, the fact that even recognizing that dynamic, that is part of the work. I think that absolutely does recognize a level of commitment to this work. Elizabeth, what would you add?
Well, I would say that, no one wants to be called performative, but you shouldn't also be scared of it. That's part of, again, that's part of the journey. Don't let your fear of being called out on something keep you from doing the work, because anti-racism is just keeping at it again and again. And if you accidentally say all lives matter, or if you post a selfie that may be in questionable taste, it's okay. Again,